If there is any measure by which betrayal might be weighed, then the word-bearers would sit at the very highest edge of it. They had once been counted among the most faithful and relentless warriors of the Imperium, men who carried its ideals from one conquered world to another, believing deeply in the future they helped to build. Yet their fall was not sudden, nor did it come like a single storm breaking across the sky. Instead, it gathered slowly across long years, quiet and deliberate, until the poison of it had seeped into everything they once claimed to defend. In their earliest days, the warriors of the 17th Legion were known for devotion that few questioned. They did not simply serve the Imperium's cause. They carried its vision as if it were something sacred, something that must be spoken and defended wherever humanity struggled beneath the long shadow left by Old Night. Their loyalty appeared unquestionable, and only the intensity of their belief ever drew attention from those who fought beside them. Long before the Emperor's armies pushed out into the stars, the wars fought upon Terra had already revealed that this was never meant to be a simple campaign of conquest. The Unification Wars and the great endeavor that would follow them were battles of ideas as much as battles of armies. The Emperor sought to bring scattered worlds and broken peoples beneath a single rule shaped by reason and knowledge. And when resistance was broken, he often chose to accept surrender rather than erase those who had stood against him. There were limits to that patience, however, for some beliefs could never exist beside the ideals the Imperium intended to spread. The worship of gods and the stubborn survival of superstition were seen as remnants of the darkness that had once gripped humanity. Such things were treated not merely as errors, but as dangers that could drag the species back into ignorance. In that quiet war fought inside the minds of conquered populations, the 17th Legion found its purpose. From the beginning, its warriors stood apart from many of their brother legions. They fought with the same discipline and ferocity expected of all the Legiones Astartes, yet there was something colder in the way they carried out their duty. Many had been recruited from the sons of defeated enemies of the Emperor, and they had grown up knowing the crimes of their forebears and the narrow path that had allowed them redemption. Their battles were not fought for glory, nor for pride. They fought because their duty demanded it, and because they believed deeply in the cause they served. Where other legions might respect the courage of a resisting foe, the warriors of the 17th Legion saw little honor in defiance. In their eyes, resistance to the Emperor's ideals could only be corrected through repentance or through ruin. Their approach to war was therefore direct and purposeful, stripped of ceremony, because the true struggle in their minds had always begun, long before weapons were raised. At the moment of their creation, they were given a name that marked this role clearly. Among the 20 legions, they alone were called the Imperial Heralds. The title did not imply special favor, but instead described the task that awaited them whenever worlds clung to old religions or the lingering fears of Old Night. Often, a single warrior would be sent ahead of the Legion's armies, clad in black armor and hidden behind a skull-shaped helm, carrying the winged mace of Imperial authority. Standing alone before temples, cult strongholds, or the courts of wandering prophets, that herald would speak the Emperor's ultimatum with calm certainty. The people before him would be given a choice: to obey abandon their false beliefs and accept the Imperial truth, or to stand firm and face destruction. Some who heard those words surrendered their idols and accepted the new order. Others refused, and many heralds died after cutting down hundreds who rushed upon them in anger or fear. Yet no matter how such meetings ended, the gray armored warriors of the Legion would eventually arrive in force, bringing fire and thunder to reshape whatever still resisted. When the fighting ended, the Imperial Heralds began a different work. Libraries were searched and divided into texts of truth and texts of falsehood. Statues and sacred objects were dragged from temples and shrines and thrown onto growing pyres beside the books that had preserved old beliefs. Those who had guarded such traditions were brought before those flames and given a final choice between the Imperial truth or the same destruction awaiting the idols they had once defended. When the fires finally died and the temples had been torn down to bare stone and dust, the warriors of the Legion would depart, leaving behind populations that had been forced to step into a different way of thinking. Across Terra during the final years of the Unification Wars, this pattern repeated again and again until another name slowly replaced their formal title. Among the Imperium's people, and even among their fellow legions, the 17th were rarely called the Imperial Heralds anymore. Instead, they were known by a name that captured the harsh certainty of their work and the quiet destruction they carried with them wherever belief stood against the Imperium. They were called the Iconoclasts. Colchis was a world where faith hung in the air as naturally as dust carried by the wind across the desert plains. The people of that distant world had long believed that unseen powers guided the turning of their lives, and devotion to higher beings was woven deeply into every custom they followed. Their world had once possessed great technologies long ago, yet those memories had faded into legend during the long darkness of old night. Generations lived and died beneath the same quiet expectations. Disease would sometimes sweep across the land and claim many lives, yet the people believed such suffering would eventually pass. Wars erupted between kingdoms and stained the soil with blood, yet joy and renewal were always expected to follow. Kings rose and kings fell, but the gods were believed to endure beyond every change. Into that world came a child who had not been born there. During the scattering of the Primarchs from the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, the infant Lorgar had been cast through the warp along with his brothers. His gestation capsule eventually descended from the heavens and came to rest upon the feudal world of Colchis. When the capsule was discovered, it was found by a wandering tribe of desert outcasts known as the Declined. Their chieftain, Fan Morgal, saw the strange child and chose to protect him, naming him Lorgar, which in the Colchisian tongue meant rain caller. The child grew at an unnatural pace, and within only a short time he had already reached the size of a young boy. Soon afterward, a caravan led by the exiled priest Kor Fa-Eron encountered the tribe and the mysterious child they sheltered. Kor Fa-Eron had once served within the Covenant, the ruling priesthood of Colchis, yet he had been cast out from the capital city of Vardesh because he had argued that the faith should convert others with greater force. When he saw Lorgar, he immediately believed the boy carried the favor of the powers he worshipped. Gorfeyron convinced the child to follow him. Then, to conceal the truth of Lorgar's origin, he killed Fane Morgul and the members of the Declined who had taken the infant in. From that moment forward, he raised the Primarch within his wandering caravan, shaping him through harsh discipline and frequent cruelty. Though the young Lorgar endured both emotional and physical abuse, he absorbed every teaching he could find within the Covenant's traditions. The religion of Colchis worshipped 4 divine beings, which were believed to rule the cosmos together. Yet as Lorgar studied its doctrines, he slowly came to believe that these 4 powers were bound together by a single greater force, which he began to call the One. Gorfeyron rejected this idea at first and punished Lorgar for speaking of it, though he also recognized the extraordinary abilities growing within his pupil. Despite the cruelty he suffered, Lorgar remained loyal to his foster father and even protected him when members of the caravan rebelled against Gorfeyron's treatment of the boy. During those wandering years, he also formed bonds with others among the caravan's followers, including the mercenary captain Axata and a captive teacher named Nairo. As Lorgar matured, his gifts became impossible to ignore. His voice carried a powerful charisma, and his sermons gathered followers who believed in his vision of a single divine power guiding the universe. Those who accepted his teachings called themselves the Godsworn, and they soon looked to Lorgar as their spiritual leader. Gorfeyron eventually abandoned the harsh punishments he had once inflicted and began to show his adopted son a degree of approval. He named Lorgar the Bearer of the Word, and the Primarch's growing movement soon spread across Colchis as he freed slaves and drew more followers to his cause. With a great host of Godsworn at his back, Lorgar marched upon the capital city of Faradesh. When he delivered a blazing sermon before its gates, the city opened to him, and the lower priests of the Covenant presented the corpses of their own rulers as an offering to their new conqueror. From that moment, the Godsworn moved steadily across Colchis, converting many cities peacefully while destroying those who refused their message. The final resistance stood within the city of Gaia-Varla, which was protected by an ancient device from the age of technology known as a storm generator that surrounded the city with a raging tempest. When Lorgar approached the storm, the winds parted before him, allowing his army to pass through and capture the final stronghold. With the fall of Gaia-Varla, the entire world of Colchis came under his rule, and Lorgar named Gorfeyron as the High Priest of the Covenant, while declaring that their work had only just begun. As Lorgar's influence grew across Colchis, many within the Covenant's established hierarchy began to watch him with rising suspicion. The Primarch had long been troubled by visions that came to him without warning, images of a mighty warrior clad in shining bronze armor approaching their world. Beside that figure stood a towering giant robed in blue, bearing only a single eye that looked across the future. These visions grew stronger over time until Lorgar began to proclaim openly that the one true god he worshipped would soon arrive upon Colchis. His preaching stirred the people deeply, drawing them away from the old traditions that had honored the four powers of the Covenant. Those who followed him believed that the One would soon appear among them and that their world must be ready to receive him. The leaders of the Covenant could no longer tolerate this challenge to their authority. They declared Lorgar a heretic to the ancient ways and sent priests and soldiers to seize him. Those who came to arrest the Primarch were killed by the Godsworn who protected him, and the fragile balance of power across the planet shattered in an instant. Colchis split into two opposing faiths. One faction clung to the old faith and the worship of the four powers, while the followers of Lorgar gathered beneath the banner of the Godsworn and the belief in the one God. Soon the entire world was drawn into a vast religious war that forced every city and village to choose its allegiance. The struggle became known as the Schism Wars and lasted for 6 long years. During that time, armies marched beneath banners of faith, while temples and strongholds changed hands again and again. The conflict finally ended when Lorgar's followers stormed the Cathedral of Illumination within the capital city of Faradesh, the very temple where the Primarch had once studied as a youth. The monks who defended the cathedral were killed, and the last center of organized resistance to Lorgar's teachings collapsed. It was said that during or shortly after this final struggle, nearly 1/3 of the people of Colchis had opposed him, and the first Great Purge was carried out by warrior monks chosen personally by the Primarch. With the war finally ended, Lorgar stood before the gathered masses and promised that the God he had spoken of would soon arrive. He told them that within a single year, their world would witness the coming of that divine figure, and that when the moment arrived, they would know him by a single name. They would call him the Emperor. Corfiran, though loyal to his adopted son, confessed that he still believed in the older gods of the Covenant as well. Yet he accepted that the one God stood above them all, a belief quietly shared by many who had followed Lorgar through the long years of war. In time, those lingering loyalties would plant the seeds of darker destinies for the Legion that would one day bear Lorgar's word across the galaxy. The long-awaited moment arrived when the Emperor's great crusading fleet finally reached the world of Colchis. The year was 857 of the 30th millennium, and the arrival came less than a local year after Lorgar's final victory over the Covenant. For the Primarch, it felt as though every vision he had ever received had quietly guided him toward this single meeting. When the Emperor descended from his landing craft, he did so clad in golden armor that shone beneath the light of Colchis' sun. At his side stood the towering Primarch Magnus the Red, while warriors of the Thousand Suns Legion formed a silent escort beside them. To Lorgar, who had spent years speaking of a coming god, the sight before him seemed like the fulfillment of prophecy. Without hesitation, the Primarch fell to one knee in reverence, and the people of Colchis followed his example as an entire world bowed in worship. Lorgar believed with absolute certainty that he now knelt before the divine being he had foreseen in dreams and visions. The Emperor, however, did not accept such worship in the way Lorgar expected. When father and son met face to face, the Emperor instead spoke of duty and of the great purpose awaiting the Primarch among the stars. He instructed Lorgar to gather the strongest warriors of the Godsworn and bring them into the ranks of the 17th Space Marine Legion, the Imperial Heralds who had been created from his own genetic lineage. Lorgar accepted the command with devotion, believing that his true calling was to spread faith in the God Emperor across the growing Imperium. Yet the Emperor repeatedly reminded him that the Imperium was founded upon the Imperial Truth, a doctrine built upon reason and knowledge that rejected religion entirely as superstition. Despite those warnings, the people of Colchis reorganized every element of their belief around the worship of the Emperor as their divine savior. Great celebrations filled the world for many months, as temples were raised and ceremonies performed in honor of the new god they believed had come among them. The Emperor tolerated these displays only briefly, for his attention remained fixed upon the vast crusade unfolding across the galaxy. When the celebrations finally ended, Lorgar was formally granted command of the 17th Legion and took his place as its master. Cor Phaeron endured the difficult process of genetic enhancement that transformed him into a transhuman warrior resembling a space marine, and he became the Primarch's closest advisor and commander of the Legion's first company. Soon afterward, Lorgar left Colchis to join the Emperor's crusade among the stars. Regents were appointed to rule his world in his absence, and the Primarch believed he was faithfully obeying the divine will of his father. Even the Emperor's repeated claims that he was not a god seemed only to deepen Lorgar's certainty, for in the Primarch's mind, only a true god would ever deny his own divinity. The belief that the Emperor was divine had existed long before Lorgar ever knelt before him. From the earliest days of his conquests, there were whispers among conquered peoples that the being who commanded such power could not belong to the ordinary realm of mortals. Many of those who had been defeated by his armies struggled to explain what they had witnessed, and so they turned to the only language their traditions offered. Some called him an angel who had descended from the heavens, while others believed him to be a spirit that walked among mankind. A few even feared he might be a demon of unimaginable strength. Yet many voices rose together in a single word that carried both awe and fear. They called him a god. When Lorgar came to lead the 17th Legion, he carried that belief within him quietly. Though he never openly proclaimed the Emperor's divinity during the early years of the Great Crusade, neither did he ever deny it when the subject arose. His speeches praised the Emperor's vision for humanity and the path he had laid before them, yet careful listeners would notice that Lorgar never spoke words rejecting the possibility of divine nature. Idols were still destroyed, and the religions of conquered worlds were condemned as falsehoods that trapped mankind in ignorance. The warriors of the Legion continued their duty as the Emperor's heralds, tearing down temples and silencing cults wherever they found them. Yet beneath that surface of obedience, a quiet faith continued to grow among some of Lorgar's closest companions. One expression of that belief appeared in a document written by the Primarch himself, It was known as the Lectitio Divinitatis, a work in which Lorgar explained the reasons he believed the Emperor to be divine. Though the text remained controversial during its time, it would later become the foundation of a vast religion that spread across the Imperium after the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. Lorgar's ideas did not remain confined to his own thoughts. Some among the Legion, including figures such as Heligar, Maedro Vessar, and Ustun Jo, were drawn toward his belief and began to share it quietly among their brothers. Through such influences, the spirit of the 17th Legion began to change in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. The Legion still fought in the same disciplined manner as before, yet the meaning they attached to their victories began to shift. Conquest alone no longer seemed enough, and the warriors began to think more deeply about the faith and purpose carried within them as they marched across the stars. Ceremony slowly took on greater importance among them, and the black-armored heralds who had once delivered the Emperor's ultimatums gained a new role within the Legion. These warriors became officers known as chaplains, guardians of the Legion's moral strength, who guided their brothers through word and ritual as much as through battle. When worlds were destroyed or populations punished for their defiance, the acts were carried out with a solemn gravity that resembled sacred rites. A chaplain might stand among the warriors while scattering the ashes of defeated enemies, speaking ritual words that echoed across silent ranks of armored figures. New terms drawn from the language of Colchis began to appear in their speech, words shaped by the dust and incense of old temples. Apostles, athemes, and creeds slowly entered the vocabulary of the Legion. Even the dangerous ideas that strayed from accepted doctrine began to be described with a word once found in ancient religions. They began to call such thoughts heresy. Lorgar guided his legion through the long years of the Great Crusade, while the warriors, once known as the Imperial Heralds, carried out a mission unlike that of most other legions. Ancient scriptures of older faiths were gathered and burned. Icons of forgotten gods were torn down, and in their place, the 17th Legion quietly raised monuments devoted to the Emperor of Mankind. Across newly conquered worlds, the Legion oversaw the building of vast temples and towering cathedrals, structures meant to stand above the ruins of earlier beliefs and remind the population who now ruled the stars. Their chaplains spoke often and at great length, producing enormous devotional works that praised the Emperor's righteousness, while delivering sermons that could stir entire cities into reverent silence. Because of this work, the progress of the Legion was slow when measured against the pace of the other legions. A world brought to compliance by the word bearers was not simply conquered and left behind. It was reshaped carefully, sometimes patiently, until its people embraced the Emperor, not merely as a ruler, but as a divine presence, guiding humanity. The transformation of the 17th Legion itself took many solar decades to unfold. Even though the Legion was already vast before Lorgar was reunited with it, the Primarch never attempted to reshape its spirit all at once. Instead, he spoke quietly to his warriors, drawing their thoughts toward faith with the same careful skill that other Primarchs used to win battles. Step by step, the belief in the Emperor's divinity spread through the Legion. The chaplains became the voice of this quiet change, adjusting the guidance they offered to their battle brothers, while new fraternities appeared beside the Legion's traditional command structures. To outside eyes, these groups seemed no different from the warrior societies found in other legions, though their deeper purpose was to nurture belief. In time, the echo of that slow conversion would reach far beyond the Legion itself. The same patience and understanding of belief would later allow Lorgar to influence other legions and draw the Imperium toward darkness, though in those early years the process seemed only like devotion. It might appear strange that warriors once raised to destroy superstition would come to embrace faith themselves. Yet within the hearts of the 17th Legion, many had always searched for a greater meaning behind their wars, and when belief offered a cause worthy of their fervor, it filled the space that reason alone could never occupy. Another quiet force shaped the Legion during those years. The Great Crusade carried the legions across countless battlefronts, and constant warfare mixed veterans with new recruits drawn from many worlds. The older Terran-born warriors who had once been iconoclasts gradually became fewer, while sons of Colchis and other newly conquered worlds filled the ranks. Many of those recruits had never known the Legion before Lorgar's influence. They accepted the teachings given to them because they had no earlier memory to challenge them. Among those from Colchis, the idea of the divine had been present since birth, woven into every thought and tradition. When the last of the old iconoclast traditions had faded and the Legion stood united in belief, Lorgar sealed the transformation with a final ritual. The Imperial Heralds would now carry a different name. They would be known as the Word Bearers. To the wider Imperium, the name seemed to describe their role in spreading the Imperial truth among humanity. For Lorgar, it held another meaning entirely, one that reflected his true purpose of giving humanity faith in the God who stood at its pinnacle. Among the Primarchs, Lorgar remained unusual. He possessed a deep belief that religion represented the highest form of human expression, and he carried within him an unshakable conviction that the Emperor was a divine being walking among mortals. Because of that conviction, he tried to share his faith wherever the Legion traveled. Every world the Word-Bearers encountered during the Crusade became a place where that belief was spoken openly, even though it stood in quiet opposition to the Imperial truth that rejected all gods. Other Primarchs looked upon Lorgar with little respect. His thoughtful nature and reluctance toward violence made him seem weak beside brothers who conquered systems with brutal speed. While their legions left trails of devastation among the stars, the Word-Bearers remained behind to reshape the worlds they had taken. For Lorgar's secrecy was never enough. He had seen the broken societies left behind after conquest, worlds once ruled by alien tyrants or bound by older beliefs that had now been stripped away. Standing among those ruins, he could not keep silent about what he believed to be the truth. As new systems fell to the 17th Legion, their populations were taught that the Emperor was not merely a ruler, but the one true God of humanity. Temples rose from the rubble of conquered cities, while chaplains and mortal preachers moved among the people, speaking of the divine authority that now governed them. Lorgar himself often stood before crowds and spoke with quiet conviction, his words guiding countless listeners toward reverence. With time, entire populations were converted by the power of those sermons alone. New cities were raised where the old ones had burned, and above them rose vast monuments dedicated to the Emperor's worship. Beneath those foundations lay the remains of those who had refused to accept conversion, silent reminders of the cost of defiance. The worlds reshaped by the word-bearers prospered within the Imperium. Their loyalty to Terra remained unquestioned, their tithes arrived on time, and their devotion seemed complete, even though few outside the Legion understood the true nature of that devotion. Rumors eventually began to spread among Imperial forces who fought beside the word-bearers. Soldiers spoke quietly about the Legion's rituals and about the intensity of their zeal, wondering whether the old iconoclasts had themselves become followers of belief. Yet the Great Crusade stretched across the galaxy, its fleets scattered among countless campaigns. Communication passed slowly through the warp, and the vastness of the war meant that certainty was rare. The Emperor and his council could not examine every rumor that drifted across such distances. Trust in the Primarchs remained the only practical choice, and whispers alone were not enough to question the loyalty of an entire legion. What finally drew attention to the word-bearers was not rumor, but simple arithmetic. Conquering worlds required time and effort, yet the 17th Legion seemed to claim far fewer victories than their brothers. Where other legions secured dozens of compliance systems, the word-bearers often brought only a handful into Imperial control. The growing disparity eventually forced the Imperium's military administrators to look more closely. Expeditions were dispatched to the worlds that the word-bearers had conquered. The investigators expected to find stubborn resistance or unusual conditions that had slowed the Legion's progress. Instead, they discovered that the worlds had not delayed the word-bearers through resistance at all. The Legion remained long after conquest was complete, rebuilding cities, shaping societies, and ensuring that faith in the Emperor would endure through temples and rituals that took far more time to establish than simple compliance. And the belief they had gifted those worlds was clear. The Emperor of mankind was worshipped there not only as ruler, but as the one true God of humanity. For many years, the loyalty of Lorgar and the word-bearers to the Emperor remained beyond question. The worlds they governed delivered their tithes faithfully in his name, and every command from Terra was accepted without hesitation across the systems the Legion had brought into compliance. For almost a full century, the word-bearers had fought and expanded the Imperium, and throughout that long span, the Emperor had never openly reprimanded his son for the devotion the Legion displayed toward him. Yet beneath that silence, the Emperor's concern slowly grew. While he had once tolerated the spiritual nature of Lorgar's beliefs, the steady pace of the Great Crusade eventually made the Legion's slower progress impossible to ignore. At last, the Emperor ordered that the word-bearers abandon their religious activities entirely. Their purpose was to reunify the galaxy beneath the secular ideals of the Imperial Truth, not to spread worship centered on his own supposed divinity. The Emperor had long rejected organized religion, believing that humanity should be guided by reason and the pursuit of knowledge, rather than devotion. The idea that he might be worshipped as a god troubled him deeply, especially when the word-bearers enforced that belief through violence against those who resisted conversion. Once the reports of their actions reached his court, a response became inevitable. The records of what followed are incomplete, though fragments suggest that the Emperor waited some time before acting, perhaps seeking confirmation or hoping that the rumors would prove false. Some accounts claim that he confronted Lorgar directly and warned him to abandon the path he had taken. Whether those meetings truly occurred cannot now be known with certainty, but what remains clear is that the Emperor eventually chose to intervene. He summoned another of his sons to assist in delivering that judgment. Robot Guilliman of the Ultramarines was known for discipline and unyielding honesty, qualities that made him the instrument the Emperor required. No witness recorded the private conversation between the Emperor and Guilliman, and the Primarch himself never revealed what was said. Yet it seemed that the Emperor did not wish to destroy the word-bearers, only to correct them and return them to the proper path. The Ultramarines represented everything the word-bearers might have been. Their conquests were swift, their record of victories unmatched, and the realm of Ultramar had already become a flourishing network of loyal star systems. In many ways, the two legions reflected one another. Both sought order and stability after conquest, yet one pursued it through faith, while the other relied on structure and governance. The Emperor's choice may have been meant to show Lorgar what his legion could become if it abandoned its spiritual path. The message would not be delivered quietly. The Emperor ordered a great task force to accompany the Ultramarines, supported by the Legio Custodes and the Imperial Regent Melchidor the Sigillite. Their destination was the world of Kur, a planet cherished by the word-bearers. Its capital city, Monarchia, had been raised by the Legion as what they believed to be the perfect city, filled with cathedrals and monuments devoted to the worship of the Emperor. When the Ultramarines arrived, they destroyed Monarchia completely, reducing the city to ruins that smoldered across the landscape where its towers once stood. After the destruction, the entire Word-Bearers Legion was summoned to the planet's surface. 100,000 Astartes gathered there, forced to stand before the ashes of the city that had symbolized their devotion. The Emperor himself appeared before them and commanded every warrior to kneel. His psychic will pressed down upon them all, including Lorgar, and none could resist. Standing among the ruins of Monarchia, the Emperor spoke plainly. He told them they had failed both him and humanity, and that he was no god who would accept such worship. When he departed, he left behind a legion humbled and a Primarch shaken to the core of his beliefs. Lorgar withdrew into silence and grief, struggling to reconcile the faith that had shaped his life with the rejection he had just witnessed. Some later observers would claim that the seeds of everything that followed were planted in that moment. After the destruction of Monarchia, the history of the Word-Bearers divides into two different paths. One is the history the Imperium believed for decades afterward, the story of a legion chastened by its mistakes and determined to redeem itself. The other history remained hidden in shadow, known only through fragments that Imperial scholars have struggled to piece together. To outward appearances, Lorgar retreated for a time from the Great Crusade. The Legion seemed absent from many campaigns, as though reflecting on the humiliation it had endured. When the word-bearers returned, they behaved very differently from before. Their conquests became swift and relentless, entire civilizations falling beneath their advance as worlds burned and knelt before the Imperium. The trail of victories they left behind resembled a cloak stained with blood. Observers across the Crusade believed the Legion had accepted the Emperor's rebuke and now fought with grim determination to erase the shame of the past. Even the Emperor seemed satisfied that his son had learned from the censure and would one day fulfill the role intended for him. Yet beneath that appearance, something far darker was beginning to take shape. Lorgar had been shaken deeply by the destruction of Monarchia and the collapse of everything he believed. In that moment of doubt, the powers of the warp may have reached out to him, offering the higher truth he had long searched for and which the Emperor had refused to grant. The exact voices that guided him remain uncertain. Many believe that Cor Phaeron, Lorgar's adoptive father and advisor, played a role, as did the Legion's first chaplain Erebus. Both men had been raised in the old faith of Colchis, a belief system that may have already been touched by the powers of the warp long before Lorgar's arrival on that world. Another fragment from that time speaks of something called a pilgrimage, though its true meaning remains unclear in the surviving records. What is certain is that the Legion that returned to the Crusade after Monarchia no longer served the Emperor in truth. For more than 4 decades, the word-bearers maintained a mask of loyalty while quietly preparing for events that would one day ignite a war across the galaxy. Their renewed campaigns allowed the Legion to expand rapidly while spreading a new and hidden creed among the worlds they conquered. During those years, dissent within the Legion seems to have been removed entirely. The last Terran-born iconoclasts and any warriors unwilling to accept the new faith likely disappeared without ceremony. At the same time, the influence of the word-bearers spread quietly into the machinery of the Imperium itself. By the time the War Master Horus finally fell to the temptations of the ruinous powers, the groundwork for rebellion had already been laid by Lorgar and his Legion. Scholars who are willing to search through forbidden accounts have pieced together fragments of what followed the destruction of Monarchia. After the Emperor's rebuke, Lorgar withdrew into the private chambers of his flagship, the Fidelitas Lex, and for a long time he refused to speak with anyone except his closest confidants. Among those few allowed to approach him was Cor Phaeron, the Legion's first captain, and a figure who had raised Lorgar on Colchis as a member of the Covenant. Cor Phaeron had guided him since childhood and remained his most trusted lieutenant and advisor. Soon afterward, Lorgar also summoned Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, another man who had long shared his confidence and his spiritual concerns. Both Cor Phaeron and Erebus sympathized deeply with Lorgar's longing for faith. They believed that the Legion's devotion deserved gods who would truly welcome worship rather than reject it. In quiet conversations, they revealed to Lorgar the existence of other divine powers, beings once revered within the ancient traditions of Colchis. These were the Chaos Gods, entities that accepted and even demanded the fervent worship that the Emperor had denied. Through these revelations, the first seeds of the coming civil war were planted within the Word-bearers. Lorgar became intrigued by the idea that true gods might exist beyond the Imperium, and he demanded that his legion search for them. Cor Phaeron and Erebus proposed a journey they called the Pilgrimage. The idea echoed ancient myths shared across many human worlds, stories describing a sacred path where mortals might stand in the presence of gods. Such a place did in fact exist, though few understood its true nature. The Immaterium, the realm known as the Warp, was dominated by vast metaphysical beings that humanity would later call the Chaos Gods. Encouraged by his advisors, Lorgar set out with the serrated sun chapter of his legion toward the distant edges of Imperial space as part of the 1301st Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade. At that time, Lorgar had not yet fully embraced chaos. Though his loyalty to the Emperor had already faded, he believed that the Emperor had been wrong to deny humanity's natural instinct to seek the divine. Lorgar intended to discover whether other gods truly existed and whether they deserved the devotion that the Emperor had rejected. For this reason, the Word-bearers continued to participate in the Great Crusade, though their campaigns now concealed the true purpose of their journey. The fleet carried another presence as well. 5 warriors of the Legio Custodes had been assigned to watch the Legion closely, ensuring that the Word-bearers did not fall into the same errors that had brought about the destruction of Monarchia. Their search for knowledge eventually led the fleet to the Cadia system, located beside a vast warp storm that the Imperium would later name the Eye of Terror. Within that region, the Master of Astropaths began to hear strange voices in the warp. These voices spoke not only to him, but also directly to Lorgar himself. They were the whispers of entities dwelling within the Immaterium, voices that confirmed Lorgar's growing belief that the universe contained powers beyond the Emperor's understanding. The fleet entered orbit around an unfamiliar world. From there, a landing force composed of Imperial Army soldiers, Word-bearers, custodians, and machines of the Legio Cybernetica descended to the surface. The warriors were met by tribes of primitive humans who wore ragged clothing and carried spears tipped with stone blades. Despite their simple weapons, the tribes showed little fear when facing the armored giants before them. Many among them possessed eyes of a deep violet color that reflected the distant glow of the Eye of Terror. Although the custodian Vendetta urged that the tribes be destroyed, the Word-bearers chose instead to approach them peacefully. From among the gathered people stepped a strange woman who greeted the Primarch by name. She called him Lorgar Aurelian, and welcomed him to the world of Cadia. The woman was a chaos priestess named Ingadel, and her words would guide Lorgar further along the path that would lead him toward heresy. In time, Ingadel performed a ritual that transformed her into a demon prince, known as Ingadel the Ascended, bearer of what she called the primordial truth. She then guided the scout vessel Orpheo's Lament into the Eye of Terror itself. Within that terrible region of space, the serrated Sun Chapter witnessed the shattered remains of the ancient Eldari civilization. The Crone worlds they encountered were lifeless ruins scattered throughout the darkness. Ingadel told the word-bearers that the Eldari had failed because they had rejected the truth of chaos when their own god was born. According to her tale, the chaos god Slanesh had awakened only to find its worshippers abandoning it in fear. From that grief, she claimed, came the great storm that formed the Eye of Terror. Standing among the ruins of that fallen empire, the word-bearers were shown what Ingadel called the primordial truth. She warned them that humanity would suffer the same fate unless it embraced the worship of chaos willingly. Eventually, the surviving warriors returned to Cadia and told Lorgar everything they had witnessed within the Eye. The Primarch himself soon traveled into that realm and encountered the Chaos Gods directly. When he emerged from the Immaterium, he ordered the destruction of the planet below. A cyclonic bombardment wiped out the original inhabitants of Cadia so that no others could learn what the Legion had discovered there. Yet Cadia's location beside the Eye of Terror remained strategically valuable, and centuries later the Imperium sent colonists to settle the abandoned world once again. Those settlers eventually became the ancestors of the modern Cadian population, many of whom developed the same violet eyes that had marked the earlier tribes. The revelations of the primordial truth changed Lorgar and the word-bearers forever. They became the first of the Legiones Astartes to turn their hearts toward the worship of the Chaos Gods. In the remaining years of the Great Crusade, the Legion worked quietly to spread that belief among humanity. Through manipulation and hidden influence, they eventually persuaded several Primarchs to join their cause, most notably the War Master Horus. When it became clear that humanity would not accept chaos willingly, Lorgar helped set in motion the terrible wars that followed. The battles at Istvan and the wider rebellion known as the Horus Heresy were shaped by the plans he had helped prepare. When Horus declared his rebellion openly, the word-bearers stood among the first legions to support him. The many worlds they had conquered during the Crusade also joined the traitor cause, their populations already steeped in secret devotion to the ruinous powers. From those corrupted worlds, millions of cultists rose to serve the Legion, fueling the fires of the heresy and carrying the word-bearers' faith far beyond the end of the Great Crusade. As the Horus Heresy spread across the galaxy, the monstrous battleship known as the Furious Abyss began its long journey toward the realm of Ultramar, departing after its secret construction by the Dark Mechanicus on the Jovian moon of Thule. The word-bearers had built the vessel for vengeance against the Ultramarines, intending to bind the loyal legion within Ultramarine while the greater hosts of the traitor legions advanced toward Terra under Vangelis spaceport for repairs when the Furious Abyss destroyed it. Before the vessel was lost, its astropaths released a desperate warning through the warp, a psychic cry of terror that was eventually received at Vangelis as a powerful scream echoing across the immaterial tides. Captain Cestus, fleet commander of the Ultramarines in that region, felt the urgency of the warning and quickly gathered what ships he could at the hub of Corrales within the Vangelis system. The force he assembled was small and improvised, composed of the warship Wrathful as his flagship along with several escorts, including the Fearless, the Ferox, the Ferocious, the Fireblade, and the Thousand Suns vessel Waning Moon, while the starship Boundless under Captain Vorloff soon joined the pursuit as well. Together, the Loyalist ships chased the Furious Abyss and struck against it in a desperate battle that quickly proved costly, for the enormous warship shattered most of the pursuing fleet. Only the Wrathful and the Fireblade survived the brutal exchange before the Furious Abyss finally fled into the warp to continue its path toward Ultramar. The two surviving ships followed the traitor vessel through the warp, yet their pursuit was cut short when the Furious Abyss deployed a psionic mine that disrupted the immaterial currents. The disturbance caused the Fireblade's Geller field to fail, and the vessel was consumed by the demonic horrors of the Empyrean before the remaining Loyalists could do anything but watch. Eventually, the Wordbearers began their true assault upon Ultramar, and the opening strike fell upon the world of Calth under the command of Cor Phaeron, the former Master of the Faith and the most devoted champion of Lorgar. From his battle barge, now renamed Infidus Imperato, he directed a full invasion of the Calth system while vowing that Mograg itself would be destroyed in vengeance for the humiliation the Ultramarines had inflicted upon the Wordbearers at Kur. The devastation was immense even before the armies clashed in earnest, for Calth's three sister planets were annihilated by massive geonuclear strikes that tore their cores apart. The system's once gentle star was poisoned with heavy metals and unstable elements that greatly intensified its radiation, and within a century the atmosphere of Calth itself would be burned away, forcing its surviving population to live in immense subterranean caverns, transformed into hive cities beneath the poisoned surface. The battle upon Calth unfolded with terrible intensity, as the Ultramarines were confronted not only by Wordbearers warriors, but by vast hordes of Chaos cultists used as living shields, along with demons unleashed from the warp itself. Yet the traitors had underestimated the resolve of their enemies, and the Ultramarines who had been born upon Calth fought with stubborn determination even while forced into a fighting retreat. Robud Kiliman coordinated the defense with careful clarity, guiding scattered pockets of resistance through precise orders and organizing them into a cohesive force, while his warships harassed the enemy in space with repeated strikes. One group led by Captain Dentanus broke through the fighting to reclaim Calth's defense laser silos, allowing the Loyalists to support their fleet from the surface while the struggle raged both above and below. The Ultramarines fought long enough for reinforcements from the rest of their legion to reach the system, and together they eventually drove the Wordbearers away from Calth, though the cost of the conflict was immense. Before withdrawing, the traitors turned the world's own orbital defenses against the Viridian Star, tearing away its outer layers and further destabilizing the system while ensuring that Calth itself would never again be habitable. At the same time, the Word-Bearers had used the battle as the focus for a dark ritual that summoned a vast warp storm called the Ruin Storm, whose purpose was to isolate Ultramar from the wider Imperium. The storm spread across the eastern reaches of the galaxy and cut off communication and travel, trapping many Ultramarines within the system and preventing them from reinforcing Terra as Horus prepared his assault. The eruption of the storm left warriors from both legions stranded beneath Calth's irradiated surface, where a brutal subterranean war continued long after the fleets had departed. Eventually, reinforcements from Magrag translated from the warp above the system and forced Gorfa-Aeron to retreat toward the Maelstrom, though much of the damage had already been done. Robot Guilliman, who had remained away from the planet during the worst of the attack due to the treacherous assault upon his fleet, gathered his surviving forces in the aftermath and swore to pursue Lorgar and the Word-Bearers for their betrayal. Yet behind the events at Caltha lay a deeper design, conceived by Lorgar himself. The Primarch had already recognized that not all among the Word-Bearers were entirely trustworthy or capable in the way he desired, and he chose to gather these doubtful elements into a single host. Under the leadership of Erebus and Gorfa-Aeron, they were sent to Calth with promises of glory, yet their mission was also a quiet purge meant to remove unreliable warriors from the Legion's future. Although the Word-Bearers succeeded in unleashing the Ruin Storm and crippling Ultramar, the campaign fell short of the victory Lorgar had envisioned. Guilliman still lived, much of the traitor fleet had been destroyed, and countless Word-Bearers, including the Galvorbak, had been abandoned beneath Calth's poisoned surface to perish in a forgotten war. For Lorgar, this outcome was still acceptable, since the storm had been conjured and the Legion had been cleansed of its doubtful elements. With those tasks complete, he turned his attention toward the greater campaign he had begun to call the Shadow Crusade. During the earliest days of the Horus Heresy, Lorgar entrusted his most devoted followers, the first chaplain Erebus and the Dark Apostle Gorfa-Aeron, with the task of unleashing vengeance upon the realm of Ultramar. The attack was born from the humiliation the Word-Bearers had once endured when they were forced to kneel before the Emperor and the Ultramarines upon the world of Kur, a memory that had never faded within the 17th Legion. The battle that followed upon Calth crippled the Ultramarines severely, and the dark ritual completed by Erebus began the vast warp storm known as the Ruin Storm, a violent tempest spreading across the eastern regions of the galaxy. Its presence threatened to divide the Imperium and prevent any reinforcement from reaching Terra, while Horus prepared his assault against the Emperor. At the same time, Lorgar launched a second offensive across the remaining worlds of Ultramar, alongside his brother Angron and the World Eater's Legion. This campaign became known as the Shadow Crusade, and in its course 26 worlds were devastated in rapid succession as the Traitor Legion sought to ensure the success of the Ruin Storm by spreading destruction across the 500 worlds. As the crusade continued, Lorgar began to notice that Angron's condition was steadily worsening. The brutal implants known as the Butcher's Nails were tearing his mind apart at an accelerating pace, and the Primarch's own physiology struggled helplessly against the damage inflicted by the devices. Seeking some way to save his brother from this relentless torment, Lorgar persuaded Angren to return to the world of Nuceria, where the implants had first been driven into his skull. There, the overlords who had created the devices might still possess knowledge that could explain their function, and once that knowledge was taken, the traitor legions intended to burn the hated world to ash. Before those plans could fully unfold, Guilliman's fleet finally caught up with the traitors near Nuceria. His temporary flagship, Courage Above All, emerged from the warp at the head of a large armada composed of many ships gathered hastily from scattered forces, a determined strike aimed directly at the heart of the enemy. The Ultramarines' warships fought with disciplined aggression, trading broadsides with the larger traitor vessels, while their smaller ships struck from a distance with carefully aimed lance fire. Guilliman directed the battle with clear purpose, intending to destroy Lorgar's flagship Fidelitas Lex piece by piece, while boarding the World Eater's flagship Conqueror and killing it from within. Yet the defenders fought fiercely, and the Conqueror, under the command of Lotara Saren, struck back with relentless determination. Several Ultramarines' ships attempting to descend toward Nuceria were destroyed before the Loyalists finally forced a path through the defenses and began landing troops upon the planet. Meanwhile, the Fidelitas Lex endured repeated attacks as the Ultramarines' armada circled the immense vessel in close combat. Its shields were already gone, and its armor cracked under the strain of continuous bombardment. Yet the great ship continued firing its macro cannons, even as escape craft began streaming from its hull. The battle became a brutal exchange, fought at close range, with warships drifting past each other through clouds of burning debris, while their crews traded blows across the void. Each strike weakened the Fidelitas Lex further until the vessel was left fighting alone amid the relentless pressure of Guilliman's fleet. During this chaos, the Ultramarines' battle barge, Armsmen, drew alongside the Conqueror and launched boarding torpedoes and assault craft, forcing the defenders to repel attackers within their own corridors. While the World Eaters struggled against the boarders, several smaller Ultramarines' ships slipped past and delivered drop pods and transports toward the surface of Nuceria. When the first pods struck the ground, their doors burst open and Ultramarines warriors emerged in disciplined formations, their armor still scarred from the horrors of Calth. They moved forward with cold determination, intent upon vengeance against the word-bearers who had scarred their realm and poisoned their homeworld. Across the burning fields of Nuceria, the Ultramarines established defensive footholds wherever they could, securing positions that allowed more of their warriors to land and join the struggle. Yet for every strong point they held, another was overwhelmed as the World Eaters surged forward in violent packs, their chain axes roaring while the Butcher's Nails drove them into relentless fury. The word-bearers advanced beside them with a different kind of resolve, marching beneath corpse-laden icons while chanting the sermons of the Book of Lorgar in grim unison. Around them, the Ultramarines fought with equal hatred, their determination sharpened by the devastation that had been visited upon Kolth. High above the battlefield, the shattered remains of the Fidelitas Lex began descending through the atmosphere, its massive engines dragging the stern downward until the dying vessel crashed into the distant ocean. Even as that colossal wreck fell from the sky, the war below drew the attention of the Primarchs themselves. Amid the thunder of battle, Robut Guilliman finally confronted Lorgar, and the two brothers faced one another in silence before their weapons clashed. The first meeting of their blows sent energy fields flaring between them, and though their warriors fought and died all around, neither Primarch spared them even a glance. Their movements were too swift for mortal eyes to follow as they struck and countered beneath the gray sky, each driven by a deep well of bitterness. Guilliman struck with brutal force, battering Lorgar with his armored fists while demanding answers for the suffering inflicted across the worlds of Ultramar. Lorgar responded with both weapon and psychic strength, driving his Crotius into the side of Guilliman's head with terrible power, while unleashing a wavering burst of telekinesis that forced his brother back. Blood streamed from Guilliman's fractured skull, while Lorgar's chest ached from the earlier blows, yet neither yielded the ground between them. Their struggle was suddenly interrupted when Angren burst from the melee, his armor shattered and his chainswords dripping with blood and fragments of ceramite. Across his chest hung a chain of skulls taken from the mass grave at Deshalika Ridge, the remains of the gladiators who had once fought beside him upon Nuceria. Driven by rage and memory, Angron hurled himself into the fight and forced Guilliman to turn and meet him in a storm of furious blows. The two Primarchs clashed with unstoppable violence, their weapons shrieking as they struck against armor while the surrounding battle faded into the background of their struggle. During the duel, Guilliman's strike shattered one of the skulls hanging from Angron's chest, and the fragments were crushed beneath his boot as he stepped forward. The sight filled Angron with a howl of anguish and fury so intense that even the air seemed to tremble around him. Watching from nearby, Lorgar felt the warp surge behind reality like a rising tide. He began chanting ancient words never before spoken by mortal lips, weaving his voice together with Angren's cry as he enacted the ritual he had long prepared. The sky above Nuceria tore open as the ruined storm spilled its power into the world, and a crimson rain formed from the echoes of countless murdered worlds began to fall upon the battlefield. Lorgar called out to the Neverborn of the Warp, binding Angron within the ritual as the transformation began. Angron's body convulsed with unbearable agony as the power of the warp consumed him, his blood changing from quicksilver to molten fire, while his flesh reshaped itself in terrible perfection. The moment marked the beginning of Angren's apotheosis into a Daemon Prince. Not all of the World Eaters accepted this fate without resistance. The few remaining librarians of the Legion sensed the power gathering around Lorgar and united their psychic strength into a single entity known as the Communion, formed from the joined consciousness of 19 minds. The Communion attempted to tear Angren's soul away from his body and confront Lorgar within the warp itself, believing that they alone could save their Primarch from corruption. Yet, the contest of wills ended in failure, for Lorgar's mastery of the warp proved stronger than the combined strength of the librarians. When Angron's transformation was complete, the newly ascended demon Primarch turned his burning gaze upon the warriors who had tried to deny him. Their fate was sealed in that moment. The fury of the newly ascended demon Primarch fell upon the remaining librarians, and each met a different and terrible end beneath Angron's wrath. With their deaths, the last fragment of the old Warhounds tradition vanished from the Legion, and the Blood God's will was satisfied by the destruction of Psykers among the World Eaters. Rabut Giliman, gravely wounded by the fighting, escaped from Nuceria and withdrew with his surviving fleet, unable to fully comprehend what his brothers had become through their alliance with the powers of chaos. Behind him, the World Eaters completed their brutal purge of the planet until no human life remained upon its surface. For Lorgar, the transformation of Angron represented a kind of salvation, since he believed he had freed his brother from the agony inflicted by the butcher's nails. With that dark act complete, the Shadow Crusade began to turn away from Ultramar, and the traitor legions prepared to rejoin Horus for the final advance toward Terra. In time, Lorgar began to doubt the strength of Horus himself, believing the War Master lacked the devotion needed to claim victory in the name of the Chaos Gods. Convinced that Horus would ultimately fail, Lorgar secretly resolved to remove him and take command of the rebellion. His attempt came after Horus was wounded during the fighting at Beta Garmin and lay comatose aboard the flagship Vengeful Spirit. Accompanied by the Dark Apostle Zardu Lyak, Lorgar approached the War Master and proposed gathering the traitor legions at Ulanor in preparation for the final march upon Terra. To strengthen his plan, Lorgar sought out Fulgrim, traveling with Lyak and a small escort through the webway, guided by an oracle disciple of Cyrene Valantian. Their journey eventually carried them into the Eye of Terror itself, where they reached the palace of Slaanesh and found Fulgrim lost within decadent pleasures beside the demon Enkeri. Fulgrim refused to return to the war, and the meeting erupted into violence until Zardu Lyak spoke the demon Primarch's true name, binding him through the power of the ritual Lorgar had prepared. With Fulgrim now under his command, Lorgar believed he possessed the weapon needed to overthrow Horus. The combined forces of the Word-Bearers and Emperor's children gathered at Ulanor, where Horus had begun assembling the traitor legions. Lorgar's plan was to unleash a psychic scream that would disorient the War Master, allowing Lyak to command Fulgrim to strike while their fleets destroyed the sons of Horus in orbit. Yet the plan had already been revealed to Horus by the mystic Actea, who warned him of the coming betrayal. When Lorgar finally confronted the War Master upon Ulanor, he was attacked immediately. Then Zardu Lyak turned against him by releasing Fulgrim from his binding, rather than ordering him to strike. Horus beat Lorgar mercilessly and demanded that he stand and fight, yet the Primarch of the Word-Bearers refused to raise his weapon and instead spoke with quiet pity about the monstrous form Horus had taken since his recovery. In the end, Horus banished him from his presence and swore to kill him if he ever returned. The 5,000 warriors of the Chapter of the Unspeaking who had followed Lyak remained with Horus and later fought during the Siege of Terra. There, the traitor forces battled for 55 days before they were ultimately repelled, and Horus himself was slain aboard the Vengeful Spirit in orbit above the throne world. After the defeat of the rebellion, the Word-Bearers withdrew into the warp rifts of the Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom, where they continued their existence within the realms where the Immaterium touches reality. From those shadowed regions they would return only to raid and destroy the worlds of the Imperium. In the long years that followed the Horus Heresy, the countless atrocities committed by the Word-Bearers eventually culminated in Lorgar's own ascension into demonhood. His transformation into a demon Primarch of Chaos Undivided echoed across the Immaterium with a triumphant cry, and within the eyes of his legion he became a figure approaching divinity itself. Afterward, he withdrew into seclusion within the Templum Inficio on the demon world of Sicarus, where he remained in deep meditation for thousands of years and forbade any interruption of his contemplation. During this long absence, the leadership of the Word-Bearers passed to a ruling body known as the Dark Council, composed of the Legion's most powerful Dark Apostles. Though the Legion remained largely united compared to many other traitor legions, the Council itself was divided between two powerful factions. One group followed the influence of Erebus, while the other supported Corfa Eron, and the tension between them shaped the future path of the Word-Bearers. From their principal strongholds upon Sicarus and the factory world of Calmech within the Maelstrom, the Legion continued to launch wars of faith against the Imperium in the name of the Chaos Gods. These campaigns sought to replace the worship of the Emperor with devotion to chaos, spreading cults and heresy across the worlds they attacked. On many occasions, their efforts intersected with the schemes of the Alpha Legion, and although the two legions sometimes fought together during the Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler, rivalry and mistrust were far more common between them. Lorgar's long meditation was interrupted only briefly when a monstrous figure began hunting the Word-Bearers through the warp. The creature was eventually revealed to be the loyalist Primarch Corvus Corax, who had been altered by the powers of the warp during his relentless pursuit of vengeance. When the two Primarchs met again, Corax dominated their duel and forced Lorgar to retreat through the portal by which he had arrived. As the passage closed behind him, Corax declared that he had caught Lorgar's scent and would continue the hunt wherever the Word-Bearers Primarch attempted to flee. Yet even these encounters were only small moments within a much greater conflict that continued to define the Legion's existence. The Word-Bearers remained committed to a total war against the Imperium, determined to tear down every symbol of the Emperor and spread the truth of chaos across the galaxy. In recent centuries, rumors have begun to spread that Lorgar himself has returned from his long seclusion. After 10,000 years within the warp, he is said to walk the mortal realms once again, leading a vast Word-Bearers host during the era that followed the birth of the Great Rift. Since the moment their devotion shifted away from the Emperor and toward the Chaos Gods, the Word-Bearers began to transform the appearance of their armor into something darker and more symbolic. The deep crimson plates they now wear are covered in runic script written in the dark tongue, markings that wind across the ceramite, like prayers meant for very different powers than those once praised by the Imperium. Devotional parchments hang from their armor, many of them fashioned from human skin and carefully inscribed with passages taken from the Book of Lorgar. These fragments speak of the philosophies of their Primarch, alongside ritual phrases and fragments of liturgy that draw the attention of demonic entities lurking beyond the veil. In this way, the word-bearers have come to embody their own name, though the words they now bear no longer glorify the Emperor, but instead proclaim devotion to the ruinous powers whose shadow stretches across reality. This transformation was not accidental, but carried out deliberately at the command of the first Dark Apostles. Under their direction, the Legion abandoned the old steely gray of their armor and replaced it with a red tone reminiscent of dried blood. The inscriptions changed as well, for where once the armor bore Imperial Truths written in High Gothic, the Legion replaced those words after their great censure with arcane sigils and hidden runes whose meanings only initiates could fully understand. As a warrior gains favor in the eyes of the Chaos Gods, the armor he wears slowly changes to reflect his growing status. A word-bearer who distinguishes himself in battle or through acts of violent ritual sacrifice may have Colchian runes carved into his battleplate by a Dark Apostle or a Chaos Sorcerer. These markings are believed to grant a measure of protection that strengthens the warrior's soul against threats both physical and metaphysical. Long ago, before the betrayal of the Horus Heresy became known, the book, symbol of the Legion, represented a search for hidden truths and deeper understanding. In the present age, that same image carries a different meaning, suggesting forbidden tomes and the knowledge required to summon demons from the warp. The chosen warriors of the Legion become living libraries of such lore, speaking blasphemous syllables that thin the barrier between real space and the Empyrean, allowing demonic beings to press their way into the material universe. Among the most experienced word-bearers, it is common to see hermetic icons etched into armor plates, geometric shapes originally devised by Lorgar himself for the summoning and binding of warp entities. Some of these symbols go further still, inviting demonic forces to take full possession of the warrior who bears them. Only the most devoted followers pursue such a path, for the power granted by such union comes at a terrible cost, leaving little of the original soul behind. In the early days before the Horus Heresy, the warriors of the Word-Bearers Legion wore power armor of a muted slate gray, its surfaces engraved with prayers and devotional phrases written in Colchian cuneiform script. These inscriptions covered their armor without the use of contrasting colors, creating an austere appearance that reflected the Legion's early religious devotion. Chaplains of the Legion shared the same gray armor as their fellow warriors, though they were distinguished by the presence of gold trim and by the sacred crosius they carried into battle. After the Emperor's harsh reprimand at Monarchia, however, the chaplains altered their appearance, repainting their armor black as a symbolic reminder of the ashes that had coated every warrior's armor during that moment of humiliation. Among the most prominent members of this priesthood was the first chaplain, Erebus, who was known to keep his head cleanly shaven while covering his scalp with elaborate tattoos depicting religious sayings and sacred imagery. It remains uncertain whether this practice was shared widely among other members of the Legion's chaplaincy. In the years following their fall to the ruinous powers, the Legion embraced a new and far more striking color scheme. Shortly after the drop site massacre on Istvan V, the Word-Bearers repainted their armor in a deep arterial red, meant to symbolize their willingness to shed blood in order to spread the truth of chaos to all of humanity. This new shade became known by several names, including Traitor's Red and Betrayer's Red, and it was often paired with trim in black or silver. The armor itself became a surface for further blasphemous expression, as heretical prayers were carved or etched directly into the ceramite plates worn by the warriors. Many traitor Marines of the Legion also began to wear devotional sheets of prayer that hung from the shoulder blades of their armor. Upon these sheets were written passages taken from the Book of Lorgar, words meant to accompany them into battle and to proclaim their faith to the dark powers they now served. By the time the Battle of Kelf unfolded, the combination of arterial red armor and deep black accents, first associated with the Serrated Suns chapter, had spread widely throughout the Legion. At the same time, the old Colchissian runic markings that once indicated rank, status, and deeds gradually fell out of use. These older inscriptions had once been understood only by fellow legionaries, their meanings depending upon the reader's level of initiation into the mysteries of the Legion. Over time, they were replaced by intricate geometric symbols, designs that could only be interpreted by those who had learned the hidden teachings revealed to Lorgar after his journey into the Great Eye. When the Primarch Lorgar first took command of the 17th Legion, he reshaped its internal organization to reflect the ideals and beliefs that had shaped him since childhood. The structures he created drew heavily from the ancient cultural mysteries of Colchis, where Lorgar had been raised under the guidance of Kor Ba-Eron. To those outside this tradition, the hierarchy of the Legion could appear baffling, for its titles and internal divisions were tied closely to symbolic systems inherited from Colchian religious practice. These complex arrangements made sense primarily to those who had been initiated into the deeper meanings behind them. When Lorgar divided the Legion into chapters, the titles and heraldry chosen for those formations were inspired by the constellations visible in the night sky above Colchis. In this way, the organization of the Legion reflected not only military structure, but also the cosmological traditions of the world that had shaped its Primarch. As the corruption of the Word-Bearers deepened and their descent into treachery continued, the inspiration for new chapters began to change. Later formations took their names and symbols from sources far darker and less visible than the star patterns that had once guided the Legion's identity. Throughout the Legion, the Word-Bearers maintain an extensive tradition of banners, icons, and vexillas that mark the presence and authority of their commanders. These standards appear at many levels of the Legion's command structure, carried into battle as both symbols of devotion and markers of identity. In their earliest form, these banners banners drew heavily from the runic traditions of ancient Colchis, displaying sacred script and symbols that echoed the religious heritage of the Legion. Over time, however, the imagery displayed upon them began to change, reflecting the growing corruption that spread through the ranks of the word-bearers. As their loyalty to the Imperium collapsed and their devotion shifted toward darker powers, the symbols upon their banners became increasingly disturbing and profane. Designs that once reflected spiritual devotion were altered into shapes and icons charged with far more ominous meaning. One example of this transformation can be seen in the Legion's famous burning book emblem. Before the humiliation at Monarchia, it had represented sacred truth and spiritual knowledge, yet after the Legion's fall, the image changed dramatically, with a leering, devilish face appearing within the flames and reshaping the meaning of the symbol entirely. The war machines of the word-bearers are rarely left unmarked, for their tanks and vehicles are covered with a wide array of symbols, icons, and ritual markings that reflect the teachings of the Book of Lorgar. To those outside the Legion, these markings often appear incomprehensible, yet to initiates they carry deep esoteric significance. Most vehicles bear the Legion's icon, placed at the center of an elaborate network of geometric lines, a design that forms a ritual pattern across the armor of the machine. Unlike the earlier traditions drawn from the culture of Colchis, this motif originates from the dark wisdom that Lorgar gained after his fall to the powers of chaos. By the time the Battle of Calth was fought, this distinctive pattern had become a common sight upon vehicles of many different classes, marking them as instruments of the Legion's dark purpose. It is also common to see lines of white text painted along the flanks of these war machines, passages carefully copied from the Book of Lorgar and displayed like proclamations of faith. Before battle, warriors often attach paper prayer rolls to the hulls of their vehicles, a custom that traces its origins to ancient Colchisian battle rites. Although these practices once carried sacred meaning within the traditions of Colchis, they were gradually twisted into darker forms as the word-bearers moved further away from the ideals they had once claimed to serve. In the era before the Horus Heresy, the Legion's badge was a symbol of faith centered on an open book crowned by a burning flame of truth. This emblem was worn proudly upon the left shoulder plate of the warriors who believed they carried the spiritual message of the Imperium. After the Legion's corruption and its devotion to the ruinous powers, that symbol was replaced with a new icon that reflected the transformation of the word-bearers. The badge they adopted became known as the Latros Sacrum, a chaos symbol that came to represent the Legion and its new beliefs. The design depicts a stylized demon's head with horns, its features twisted in a roaring expression while flames curl around it. In this single image, the Legion expressed everything it had become, revealing the beliefs that guided its warriors and the cause for which they were willing to kill. Colchis had once been a world of advanced knowledge and industry, yet during the long darkness of the Age of Strife, it slipped slowly into a feudal existence, where old machines were forgotten and the people lived beneath the weight of fading when Lorgar arrived upon that world, his presence was seen as both a blessing and a quiet omen of future ruin. For his coming brought Colchis into the Imperium, yet in time it would also mark the beginning of the planet's final fate, many hundreds of Terran years later. During the short years of Lorgar's rule, the world flourished again, and cities stirred with renewed purpose as faith and order reshaped the land beneath his guidance. Yet when the Emperor arrived and placed Lorgar at the head of the Word-Bearers Legion, the Primarch departed Colchis, and those left behind slowly allowed the world to falter. Long after the Horus Heresy had begun to tear the Imperium apart, the Ultramarines carried the war to Colchis itself, and what they found there was no longer a thriving realm, but a wounded world, its industry broken, and its people holding desperately to the last fragile remnants of civilization. Because of Lorgar's treachery, the Inquisition decreed that the planet must be cleansed, and the Ultramarines' battle barge Octavius delivered cyclonic torpedoes against the surface of Colchis. The world was already geologically unstable, and the terrible force of the bombardment awakened violent seismic upheavals that tore the planet apart until nothing remained of it at all. Even now, the location where Colchis once existed is held as a closely guarded secret within the vaults of the Inquisition. Far from that lost world, the Word-Bearers now dwell upon the demon world called Sicarus, a place that lies deep within the Eye of Terror, beneath vast clouds of drifting fire and blood. Across its surface rise immense temples and towering cathedrals alongside countless monuments raised in devotion to the Chaos Gods, while endless numbers of slaves labor without rest as they build new structures upon the crumbling foundations of older ones. The layers of construction rise higher and higher toward the dark sky, while below them spreads a tangled maze of underground passages that link the countless halls and sanctuaries together in a vast devotional labyrinth. From this dark world, the Word-Bearers' Dark Council governs the Legion, a gathering of the most powerful Dark Apostles who guide the fate of the 17th Legion, while their demon Primarch withdraws into long meditation within the Templum Inficio. The council itself rules from a colossal cathedral fortress known as the Basilica of the Word, a structure crowned by hundreds of towering barbed spires that climb for many kilometers into the grim sky, each of them studded with cruel spikes where living sacrifices are impaled. Beyond Sicarus, the Legion also holds dominion over the demonic forge world called Kalmek, hidden deep within the Maelstrom warp storm and ruled by Gorfa Aeron. From this grim stronghold, the Word-Bearers gather strength and launch their raids against Imperial worlds scattered across the eastern reaches of the galaxy. The warriors of the Word-Bearers march to war, guided wholly by the pronouncements of their Dark Apostles, whose commands are obeyed with unwavering loyalty and absolute faith. These grim leaders claim to discern the will of Lorgar through a host of strange and unsettling rites, at times seeking meaning in the entrails of sacrificial victims, at others studying the alignment of distant stars, or reading fate in the scattered patterns of cast bones. When the Dark Apostles finally declare how the coming battle will unfold, the warriors of the host obey without hesitation or question, trusting that the path has already been revealed to them. before the first clash begins, they gather together in solemn ritual, speaking blasphemous hymns and forbidden doctrines in a steady and deliberate chant that reinforces their devotion to the powers of chaos. At times, their dark prayers are answered, and it is not uncommon for them to march into war accompanied by hideous demonic entities, bound through grim pacts made with the Dark Apostles. With their damned standards raised high above them and cursed icons carried at the forefront, the Legion advances while voices thunder out catechisms and bitter canticles of hatred directed toward their enemy. As they move forward, the sound of heavy drums echoes around them in a slow and mournful rhythm, creating a relentless beat that settles into the mind and gnaws at the spirit of those who hear it. The sight of this advance can be deeply unsettling, for the steady chanting and the unbroken thunder of drums often erode the resolve of even the most determined defenders. During the night before battle, the enemy may hear dark mutterings drifting across the darkness from every direction, those murmured words blending with the distant pounding of drums, until nerves begin to fray and quiet fear spreads among the waiting ranks. What drives the word-bearers forward is their unshakable belief that they alone carry the power to save the galaxy and all of mankind, and because of that faith they will march onward even towards certain death without ever considering retreat. Any force that manages to defeat them will pay dearly for the victory, because the fury of their fanatical assault ends only when every warrior has fallen and the final voice of their chanting has been silenced. Among the Space Marines who were once known as the Imperial Heralds, and later as the Word-Bearers, the gene seed was first believed to be pure and stable, carrying none of the flaws that sometimes troubled other legions during the long years of the Great Crusade. Yet even in those earlier days, observers quietly noticed a certain quality in their nature, a steady and unyielding devotion that did not bend easily once belief had taken root. This devotion slowly revealed itself as something deeper and more troubling, for the warriors of the Legion showed a powerful tendency toward absolute conviction, holding to their beliefs with such intensity that their faith could grow into a form of fanaticism that others sometimes regarded with unease. In time, after the cataclysm of the Horus Heresy had passed and the galaxy had changed forever, the true condition of their gene seed became clearer, as long exposure to the shifting energies of the warp began to alter what had once been considered stable and reliable. Through that constant contact with the warp, the gene seed of the word-bearers became corrupted and twisted beyond any hope of redemption, and the darker traits that had always lingered within their nature were magnified until those earlier tendencies toward belief and zeal grew into something far more terrible. Even so, the Legion does not show a strong or constant tendency toward mutation among its warriors, though those individuals who do receive what they regard as the blessings of chaos often find themselves elevated in the eyes of their fellow warriors, who see such changes not as flaws but as signs of favor within the host. Among the word-bearers, belief begins with the teachings of Lorgar himself, whose words shaped a vision of a dark and solemn future for mankind, a future in which humanity lives beneath the sacred authority of the Chaos Gods. In their understanding, salvation for the human race can only be found by gathering together beneath those divine teachings and offering the devotion that these powers demand, for only such obedience can protect humanity from alien threats, the harsh rule of the Imperium, and the divisions that grow within its own kind. They believe there is only one force in the galaxy worthy of such surrender, and that force is the shadowed majesty of chaos. A truth Lorgar came to accept during the infamous pilgrimage he undertook after the capital city of Kor was utterly destroyed. From that moment forward, the path became clear in the minds of his followers, and the word-bearers came to see themselves not merely as warriors, but as missionaries who carry the faith wherever they travel. Each warrior moves through the galaxy as a bearer of doctrine, quietly spreading the message of chaos while offering its promise to any who will listen. Those who accept the faith are drawn into its service, while those who refuse are met with merciless destruction. For the Legion holds a single, unwavering belief that humanity must walk the path of chaos undivided or face extinction. At the center of this belief stands the Book of Lorgar, a sacred and terrible text that forms the foundation of their devotion. Passages from this unholy scripture are often carved directly into the plates of their power armor, each line serving as both prayer and proclamation as the Legion advances across distant worlds. When the word-bearers descend upon a planet, copies of this book are carried with them and spread among the conquered populations. Offered as the guiding voice of the Urizen, and as an invitation for the people of that world to join the service of the Dark Gods. On the battlefield itself, the words of the book are often spoken aloud by the Dark Apostles, their voices rising over the noise of war as they recite its passages. In those moments, the Legion listens closely, and the words drive them forward with unshaken resolve, pressing onward through overwhelming odds, while the teachings of Lorgar echo across the field of battle. Among the relics carried by the word-bearers, there are weapons and symbols that seem to remember the long path of the Legion itself, beginning in the days of the Great Crusade and lingering through the dark devotion that followed. One such relic is the Ashen Axe, a vicious chain axe whose blades once rose and fell upon the citizens of worlds that refused compliance, and as the Legion sank deeper into shadow, the anguish born from those killings drew the attention of demons from the warp. Over time, the weapon became a malefic focus for those unseen creatures, and those who stand against the word-bearers sometimes find their bodies refusing to move away from its swing, as if claws and talons were holding them in place, while their minds are quietly harried by entities of the aether waiting for the soul that the axe promises to deliver. Near the engines of slaughter, icons are also carried into battle. One of the most dreaded is the baleful icon. A standard view can endure for long. The 8-pointed star upon it is soaked in loyalist blood, and its stain of treachery never fades. Those who intend harm toward its bearer feel their confidence fade simply by standing near it. Word-bearers marching beneath the icon feel its dark aura as a strange warmth, like the heat of a summer sun. Those who do not serve the dark gods instead feel their skin crawl and their muscles tremble with revulsion, even if they are battle-hardened Astartes. There are also books carried by these dark preachers, and the book of the reviler is whispered about even among those who serve chaos. No one truly knows what knowledge lies within its pages, for a single glance is said to be an assault upon the senses, and the truths written there grind against the sanity of those who try to understand them. Yet some possess the strength to read those lines in full, and the reward for such endurance is not wisdom in any human sense, but the warped blessings of chaos itself. Strange mutations granted to the reader as payment for their willingness to see what should never be seen. Another relic worn rather than tarried is the crown of the blasphemer, a circlet decorated with the finger bones of defiant men and consecrated with the blood of unbelievers whose defiance could not save them. Those who place it upon their head attract the attention of entities that drift through the warp, and whether those creatures keep the wearer alive for their own amusement or for some hidden purpose matters little on the battlefield. Blades that should cut are turned aside by unseen hands. Thunderous storms of bullets vanish into the ether before they strike, and the minds of nearby enemies fill with visions of a galaxy already burning. The cursed Grosius has a history that reaches back to the earliest days of Lorgar's chaplains, when one of the first of their order carried it as a rod of office among the Legiones Astartes while watching for signs of sedition. Yet the weapon was always bound to treachery, and its first true act of violence came when it was raised to kill an ex-librarian praetor of the White Scars, beaten to death in a moment that left stains upon the Grosius which never faded. Those who worship chaos near this weapon seem to understand instinctively how to strike down the servants of the Emperor, while those who carry the Emperor's mark feel each swing of the Grosius, seeking the weakest seam in their armor. There is also the Malefic Tome, a book stitched together from the flayed skins of mortal psychers who once believed they could bargain with demons safely. Each of them took precautions, yet the very act of dealing with the warp betrayed their location to chaos worshippers who walk the material world without fear. The pages still carry the hair and birthmarks of those unwilling donors, and the dread they felt seems to linger across every piece of stolen skin, while the writing itself records true names, hexagrammatic diagrams, and hierarchies of demons that offer terrible insights into the nature of the warp. Among the relics of the Legion, there are also the scripts of Erebus, long parchments copied carefully by the first of the traitorous Dark Apostles from runes carved upon his own flesh. They were written in blood that carried traces of Lorgar's own vitae, and the words themselves are potent invocations spoken in the dark tongue. When read aloud, they guide the power of the Empyrean into real space with unsettling stability, allowing the reader to unleash unnatural deaths upon enemies or unravel the warp craft that protects them. And though the scripts fade from sight after each reading, they return whenever their bearer journeys through the warp, blossoming again so that fresh devastation may be called forth. Finally, there remains the skull of Monarchia, a relic tied to the destruction of the perfect city, whose fall shaped the destiny of the word-bearers forever. When the Ultramarines Legion reduced that city to ruin, almost nothing survived, yet one intact cranium endured among the shattered remains and was later adorned with precious metals and guarded by powerful fields. Those who stand near it feel their hatred of the Imperium swell quietly within them, as the relic continues to remind the Legion of the moment that set them upon the path of rebellion and damnation. In the long years of the Great Crusade and the war that followed, the fleet of the Word Bearers moved through the void like a dark procession, its vessels bound together by faith, ambition, and the will of their Primarch. At the center of that gathering once sailed the great battleship Fidelitas Lex, a mighty Gloriana-class vessel that carried Lorgar Aurelian himself and served as the flagship of the 17th Legion until the Ultramarines destroyed it during the Shadow Crusade at the Purge of Nuceria. Around that fallen giant moved other ships, whose names echoed across the long history of the heresy. The battleship Anarchus served beneath the command of the Dark Apostle, Ankh Heloth, while Dominus Violatus sailed as part of the 7th host of the Legion, and vessels such as Camiel and Lorgar's Spite traveled alongside them through the shifting war zones of the galaxy. The Desolator-class battleship Dark Chorus also moved within this gathering of warships, its presence another reminder that the fleet of the Word-Bearers was vast, varied, and often difficult to fully record. Some ships carried histories that stretched across many years of conflict. The cruiser Catechism of Revelation fought above Istvan during the Drop Zone Massacre, and afterward it was ordered to join the fleet sent to prosecute the Shadow Crusade in the distant Ultima Segmentum. Yet the vessel never arrived as intended, for it vanished into the warp within the Dominion of Storms during the early years of the 31st millennium. When the cruiser emerged again 2 Terran years later, it had changed in ways difficult to describe, though it remained deadly to the merchant convoys and freighters that later crossed its path. For decades, it eluded pursuit until it was finally brought to battle many years later, when boarding parties from the Grand Cruiser Bride of Petrobus reported the vessel abandoned and broken before they scuttled the drifting wreck. Even so, only a few years after that grim discovery, an undamaged Catechism of Revelation was once again confirmed to be operating among the stars near Espendor. Other ships carried their own dark transformations as the Legion revealed its allegiance to chaos. The battleship known as the Crucius Maledictus had once sailed under the name Flame of Purity before the heresy, yet its name was changed when the Word-Bearers openly declared their devotion to darker powers. Commanded by the Grand Apostle Ekodas, the vessel later suffered heavy damage during combat against the loyalist White Scars Legion. Among the most formidable creations of the Legion were the enormous Abyss-class battleships that had been constructed in secret under the direction of Lorgar. One of these, the Furious Abyss, sailed under Fleet Captain and Dark Apostle Zadkiel during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy until a small group of loyalists infiltrated the vessel and sabotaged it from within, destroying the ship before it could strike against the Ultramarines at the Battle of Calth. 2 sister ships shared its design and purpose. The Blessed Lady traveled alongside the fleet during the same era, while the Trisagion later became the new flagship of Lorgar after the destruction of Fidelitas Lex during the Purge of Nuceria. The fleet also included many battle barges that carried the warriors of the Legion across the stars. Among them were vessels such as Bathamir's Sword, Castigator, and De Profundis. Destiny's Hand sailed under the command of the first chaplain, Erebus. Dies Mortis served beneath the Dark Apostle, Bellicosa. Another battle barge, Infidus Imperator, carried the authority of the first captain, Cor Phaeron. Mortis' Majesticatus was once commanded by the Dark Apostle Seroptil, but it would eventually be destroyed. The vessel Mornsong had an older history. It was remembered as the former flagship of the long-extinct Twisting Rune chapter. Strike cruisers also traveled within the shadow of the Legion fleet, moving between war zones and expeditionary forces as the long campaigns of the Imperium unfolded. Among these were Dark Page, Maledictus Confutatus, and Moribundus Fatalis, which sailed with the 18th host of the Legion. The cruiser Dominatus Sanctus had earlier served with the 47th Expeditionary Fleet during the Great Crusade, while Infidus Diabolus came under the command of Dark Apostle Gerilek and later Dark Apostle Marduk. Another vessel, Sanctus Diabolica, would eventually be destroyed. Certain ships were tied to particular hunts and grim pursuits that unfolded during the heresy. The cruiser Monarchia served as the personal vessel of the Dark Apostle Gorgalek, often called the Preacher, from which he directed the pursuit of the Charbides after its departure from Magrog. Though far smaller than its quarry, Monarchia attempted to strike the larger vessel while both traveled through the warp, hoping to recover the fulgurite stone embedded in the corpse of Vulcan. When the assault failed and losses mounted, the weakened word-bearers found themselves under the influence of their uneasy allies from the Death Guard Legion. Still tracking the path of their quarry, Monarchia later confronted the Charbides alongside the Death Guard cruiser Reaper's Shroud above the world of Nocturne, with its commanders gone and its fate tied to the will of the 14th Legion. The vessel was deliberately sacrificed to slow the Charbides before it too was destroyed. Another cruiser named Valediction served under the Dark Apostle Dinask, an ambitious officer who wished to fight beside his Primarch during the Shadow Crusade, rather than remain behind within the Istvan system. Assigned to the outer line of picket ships, the vessel searched for surviving Raven Guard forces believed to still hide somewhere within that region. The search proved true when Valediction encountered the Raven Guard battle barge Avenger just as it prepared to enter the warp. Because the Loyalist vessel was cloaked, the word-bearers detected it only at the final moment, and the sudden jump pulled Valediction into the warp as well. Without an active Geller field to protect the ship and its crew, the vessel was torn apart by the creatures that dwell within that terrible realm. Smaller vessels also moved within the fleet, their stories often tied to single missions or violent encounters. The light cruiser Orpheo's Lament sailed among them, while the Gladius-class light cruiser Dark Sacrament joined the fleet of Monarchia during the hunt for the Fulgurite Stone and for the renegade vigilator Bartusa Narek. The ship began its search on Traoris and later moved through the outer regions of Ultramare until it was intercepted and boarded by the Ultramare's vessel Defiance of Kolth, which destroyed it after the battle. Escorting that cruiser was the Hunter-class destroyer Demagogue, where Artellus Numion of the Salamanders had been imprisoned and tortured after his capture on Draris. His interrogator, the figure known as the Unburdened Zenith Soul, sought information about the renegade Bartusa Narek, who had betrayed the Legion and attempted to keep the Fulgurite stone for himself. The destroyer met the same fate as Dark Sacrament when it confronted the defiance of Kalfa, though later events revealed that the vessel and its entire scout fleet had been sacrificed deliberately so that Zenith Sul could infiltrate the Ultramarines' prison within the fortress of Hera in an attempt to assassinate Naruk. Among the many other ships recorded within Imperial accounts were the capital vessels Crown of Colchis and Spear of Cedros, along with the transport ship Faith's Speed that traveled with the fleet during earlier campaigns. Yet beyond these names, the true shape of the Word-Bearer's fleet has become uncertain. For Imperial records after the end of the Horus Heresy do not reveal the full composition of the vessels that still sail beneath the banners of the Legion. In their earliest days, the warriors of the Word-Bearer's Legion followed the familiar structure used by many of the Legiones Astartes. Individual warriors gathered into squads. Those squads belonged to companies, and the companies themselves were gathered beneath the banners of larger chapters. This arrangement had existed even when the Legion was known as the Imperial Heralds, and it continued with little change until the long shadow of betrayal fell across the fields of Istvan. When their Primarch was rediscovered and recruits from the world of Colchis flowed steadily into the Legion's ranks, the structure itself remained recognizable, though something deeper settled into the way the Legion was organized. Beneath the practical order of squads and companies grew another quieter framework, concerned not with battlefield positions but with the shared belief and devotion of the warriors who fought within those formations. The soldiers of the 17th Legion marched and fought as others did, yet beneath their armor rested a growing devotion that shaped the spirit of every unit. Their squads often gathered in larger numbers than those of other legions, and where some commanders were content to field small tactical teams, the Word-Bearers preferred formations of greater strength. Squads of roughly 20 warriors were common within their companies, and these tactical squads formed the steady advancing line of their armies. When they moved forward across the battlefield, it was often with the deliberate weight of numbers, an advance meant to overwhelm through presence as much as through skill. Companies within the Legion were usually near 100 Astartes strong, though their exact size sometimes shifted according to their battlefield role. The Word-Bearers often devoted entire companies to a particular form of warfare, shaping them into assault forces, reconnaissance elements, or units designed to break an enemy's line through relentless pressure. These companies rarely fought alone, for the Legion favored the crushing effect of combined formations moving together in overwhelming strength. Above them stood the chapters, large groupings that might contain several hundred warriors or even several thousand. Each carried a name drawn from the constellations that shone over the skies of Colchis, and those names echoed through the Legion like distant stars remembered across the void. The serrated suns marched beneath their burning emblem, while the osseous throne, the crescent moon, the weeping hand, the coiled lash, the exalted gate, the twisting rune, the scold's bridle, and the knight's chalice carried their own symbols and traditions. When the word bearers launched campaigns during the Great Crusade, these chapters often formed the backbone of their expeditionary fleets. Although their campaigns could appear methodical and deliberate, the word bearers rarely forgot the value of symbolism. War, to them, was more than conquest alone. It was a message spoken across the stars. Because of this belief, certain formations within their order of battle took on roles that carried both practical and symbolic weight. Among them was the chapter known as the Broken Scythe, a formation built around siege engines and heavy armored vehicles whose task was the leveling of cities and fortified strongholds. Their attacks were meant to leave only shattered ruins behind, a stark sign that resistance had ended. Equally feared were the warriors of the Ashen Circle, who descended from the sky on roaring jump packs. They came as burning angels of destruction, reducing libraries and temples to ash with cleansing flame. And when the work demanded something more permanent, they carried the terrible weapon known as phosphex. Though attached to chapters, the Ashen Circle stood apart from the rest of the Legion, and only the most devoted warriors were permitted to walk within their ranks. The word-bearers also marched to war, accompanied by great numbers of mortal followers, fanatics drawn from the populations they had conquered. These warriors were bound to the Legion through faith as much as obedience, forming wild and fervent mobs that fought beside the Astartes. Though their discipline rarely matched that of the Legion itself, their presence allowed the word-bearers to unleash enormous waves of attackers upon their enemies. Before their fall from imperial favor, the structure of the word-bearers was not considered greatly unusual among the Space Marine legions, except perhaps for the striking number of chaplains within their ranks. Chapters often followed the familiar pattern of roughly 1,000 Astartes divided into companies led by captains, though the reality was often more fluid. Some chapters, like the Serrated Sons, contained only a few companies, while others expanded far beyond the usual number. Each chapter carried its own identity within the Legion, its own symbols and traditions shaped by the vision of Lorgar and the culture of Colchis. Some were remembered by emblems such as a quill marked with a drop of blood, an open hand bearing an eye in its palm, a burning book, or a scepter crowned with a skull. Others were known through fragments of their histories. The chapter of the Coiled Lash and the Crescent Moon left few details behind in imperial records, while the Iron Veil and the Third Hand would eventually vanish in the violence of the Underworld War following the Battle of Kelf. Other formations lingered in scattered recollections. The chapter of the Opening Eye once followed the command of Chapter Master Firescarel, while the Osseous Throne specialized in waves of advancing infantry, pressing relentlessly against enemy defenses. The Chapter of the Void, led by Chapter Master Tenebron, was small and often overlooked, serving behind the front lines while quietly testing new weapons and studying the Legion's growing psychic resources. Still others marched into the history of the Horus Heresy itself. The Ark of Testimony, commanded by Dorkiel Eliphas the Inheritor, took part in the Shadow Crusade and oversaw the creation of the grim structure known as the Templum de Monarchia upon the world of Cronus. The Burning Hand fought beneath the command of Dinos, whose gauntlets burned with fire from hidden gas jets within his armor, while the warriors of the Crimson Mask wore helmet plates shaped into snarling demon faces, their appearance alone enough to chill the hearts of those who faced them across the battlefield. Within the wider body of the Legion, many other chapters carried their own quiet histories and traditions, some remembered only through fragments preserved in Imperial records. The Ebony Serpent once followed the command of Chapter Master Skolinthos, while the Exalted Gate marched beneath the leadership of Uncle Shax before their destruction during the grim fighting that followed the Battle of Kalto. Among the more infamous formations stood the Flayed Hand, whose loyalty to the cause of Lorgar was never questioned, even as their stability began to fray. Their zeal burned with a dangerous intensity, and during the campaigns around Calv, many thousands of their warriors fought beside other chapters to reinforce the Legion's strength. The Flayed Hand embraced the darker teachings spreading through the Legion, studying occult rites and volunteering for the strange process developed by Erebus to create the warp-touched warriors known as the Gal Vorbak. Elsewhere, the chapter called the Graven Star gained a reputation for the violent precision of its boarding actions and assaults launched from gunships plunging through the void. Even before the Horus Heresy, their warriors were known for swift strikes delivered with ruthless determination, and their symbol, the Star of Chaos, became associated with relentless aggression during the Great Crusade. The Perpetual Spiral followed a quieter path for much of its history, often tasked with garrisoning newly compliant worlds rather than fighting at the forefront of conquest. Though their commander Silak once considered such work lacking in honor, the chapter carried out the duty faithfully and earned repeated praise from their Primarch. Later, during the campaigns of the 47th Expeditionary Fleet, the Perpetual Spiral helped lead the final assault upon a designated world before Captain Sor Talgran was chosen to return to Terra with a portion of the chapter. Publicly, this movement appeared to be a gesture of loyalty toward the Imperium, but Imperial observers later suspected that Talgran's return carried deeper motives. Beneath the formal duties of a garrison, acts of quiet sabotage were carried out according to the hidden instructions given by Lorgar himself. Other chapters developed distinct traditions that shaped the way they fought among the stars. The Quillborn, who believed themselves created as living words written into existence, served primarily as naval warriors skilled in ship-to-ship combat. In the narrow corridors and echoing chambers of starships, they moved with practiced confidence, carrying the symbol of a blood-tipped quill upon their armor. The serrated suns accompanied Lorgar during his mysterious pilgrimage into the depths of the Eye of Terror, long before the outbreak of the Horus Heresy. Their emblem, a golden sun set within dark shapes upon maroon armor, would later become tied to one of the most unsettling transformations in the Legion's history. Those who survived that journey returned as the first possessed warriors known as the Gal Vorbak. Other chapters held darker reputations even before the Civil War began. The Broken Scythe specialized in the destruction of infrastructure, reducing cities and defenses with relentless firepower. The Inscribed decorated their armor with golden runes representing forbidden concepts of chaos, while the Star of Judgment carried a fearsome legacy of scorched earth campaigns, where entire populations were deemed unworthy of imperial compliance. the Trifold Crown practiced patient attritional warfare, grinding enemies down through relentless endurance rather than swift victory. The Unspeaking followed the strange discipline of silence under the leadership of Sardu Layak, their warrior sages communicating through solemn gestures while their oath-bound servants mutilated their own tongues in grim devotion. The Twisting Rune, formed from warriors consumed by hatred toward the Ultramarines, carried a symbol of a twisted occult sigil and would also vanish during the violent conflicts that followed the Battle of Calth. At the center of all these formations stood Lorgar himself, both commander and spiritual guide to the Legion. Authority within the Word-Bearers flowed along two intertwined paths. One path followed the familiar military hierarchy, where chapter masters led chapters, captains commanded companies, and sergeants guided their squads in battle. The other path belonged to the chaplains, whose role extended beyond simple command. These warriors formed a brotherhood dedicated to the spiritual strength of the Legion. They watched over the purpose and devotion of their brothers, ensuring that each act of war aligned with the deeper faith that had begun to define the 17th Legion. Above them stood the High Chaplains, and at the center of their order presided the First Chaplain. Within the Legion, these two strands of authority, military command and spiritual guidance, often intertwined so closely that they were difficult to separate. A captain responsible for the direction of a battle would rarely challenge the judgment of a senior chaplain, for the Word-Bearers believed that understanding the purpose of war was as important as achieving victory itself. In many campaigns, the spiritual leaders determined the course of events, while the commanders carried those decisions onto the battlefield. This blending of authority could also be seen in the inner circle surrounding Lorgar, where commanders and chaplains gathered together to form the council that ruled the Legion. Among them stood two figures whose names would echo with lasting infamy: Kor, Fa, Eron, and Erebus, trusted advisors whose influence reached deeply into the decisions of their Primarch. Despite their growing reputation for religious fervor, the Word-Bearers were not known for deploying vast formations of heavy armor. Their strength rested instead in large infantry companies, supported by armored vehicles moving close beside them. When heavy armor was used, it often formed a spearhead ahead of advancing infantry, smashing through enemy defenses while squads of cataphracti terminators rode forward within Land Raider transports. Among all the chapters of the Legion, the Graven Star fielded the greatest concentration of armored units. Their aggressive use of mechanized formations brought them many victories during the Great Crusade and earned them a reputation for ruthless efficiency in attack and stubborn determination in defense. During the gathering of forces at Gomesh before the catastrophe of Calth, the armored phalanx known as Invisible Truth took up position among the heavy vehicles of the Ultramarines. Their machines waited in silent readiness under the appearance of routine exercises, while their guns slowly aligned across the unsuspecting vehicles of the 13th Legion. When the vessel Campanile struck the orbital docks and chaos erupted across the muster zone, the guns of Invisible Truth opened fire without hesitation. The first barrage left the unpowered vehicles of the Ultramarines burning, and and moments later the Land Raider transports surged forward, unleashing infantry who cut down the stunned defenders guarding the armored formations. By the time of the drop site massacre upon Istvan, the true size of the Wordbearers' Legion had grown far beyond earlier estimates. Where once the Legion numbered near 100,000 warriors, years of aggressive recruitment and accelerated gene seed implantation had swelled their ranks to far greater strength. Some observers believed their numbers might even rival those of the Ultramarines themselves. Alongside these Astartes marched immense numbers of mortal followers, fanatics drawn from conquered worlds, who were ready to die in service to the Legion. During the brutal extermination phase of the fighting on Istvan, one survivor recalled seeing tens of thousands of such warriors advancing toward the loyalist enclave of Nurin. Behind the armored warriors of the Legion stood countless more, willing to follow them into battle. Naval strength also grew quietly in the years leading to the Horus Heresy, with massive warships such as the Abyss-class vessels suggesting that Lorgar had prepared his legion carefully for the coming conflict. Among the most unsettling formations within the Legion were the Gal Vorpak, whose name in the language of Colchis meant the Blessed Sons. These warriors were originally members of the Serrated Sons, who had ventured into the Eye of Terror and returned bearing the knowledge known as the Primordial Truth. Their armor was painted red instead of the gray once worn by the Legion, marking them apart from their brothers. During the drop site massacre, their hidden nature was revealed when they confronted the Primarch Corax of the Raven Guard. Possessed by demonic entities since their journey into the Eye of Terror, the Gal Vorbak transformed before the eyes of their enemies as flesh and ceramite fused together into monstrous shapes. In that moment, they became the first of the possessed warriors who would later appear among many of the traitor legions. When the battle ended, they resumed the outward form of Space Marines once more, though the confrontation had been devastating and only a handful survived their clash with a Primarch. Those survivors became one of the most feared formations within the Wordbearers during the rest of the Heresy. After the devastation of Kolth, another formation rose from the ashes of shattered companies. Argel Dale, once part of the original Serrated Sons and spared from the massacre through temporary service with the World Eaters, returned to his Primarch and formed a new brotherhood called the Vagrajel. Known as the Chapter of Consecrated Iron, they carried forward the legacy of those destroyed in the early battles of the war. Alongside these formations operated the Ashen Circle, a brotherhood dedicated to the destruction of faiths and cultures that stood against the Legion's beliefs. Moving with Legion destroyer squads, they hunted sacred relics, priests, banners, and symbols that inspired resistance among their enemies. With hooked blades and burning weapons, they struck swiftly and without hesitation, often racing far ahead of the advancing lines in order to erase the heart of an enemy's courage. Within the darker corners of the Legion, there were also those whose ambitions carried them far beyond the limits once expected of a warrior of the Imperium. After the humiliation suffered at the hands of the Ultramarines, some word-bearers felt a restless hunger growing within them, a desire for power that could no longer be ignored. The Crimson Apostle Sardu Lyak recognized that hunger and offered gifts to those willing to accept them. Those followers became the Anakatis Cool Blade Slaves, warriors whose bodies were twisted and strengthened through unnatural influence, armed with strange blades granted by Lyak, weapons touched by alien power and dark intent. They fought with relentless ferocity in service to their master. Among the honored warriors of the Legion were those known as the Anunnaki, a Colchissian name that carried the meaning of princely sons or judges of hell. These were the warriors chosen to continue their service within the armored sarcophagi of dreadnoughts, their bodies preserved within towering engines of war so that their strength could continue to serve the Legion. During the catastrophe that unfolded at Calf, another terrifying creation appeared upon the battlefield. The Mara Gal-tainted dreadnought was first seen amidst the chaos of the fighting at Ithraca. Its warped form combining the shattered remains of a Gal four-back warrior with the armored frame of a Contemptor dreadnought recovered from the fields of Istvan. Bound together through forbidden rituals and infused with warp power, the result was a monstrous engine of destruction. The Mara-Gal carried weapons of terrible strength, including a warp-fire plasma cannon and a corrupted power claw capable of tearing through armor and energy shields alike. Its reactor burned with unnatural power while the influence of the warp bent reality itself around the machine, allowing it to stride through obstacles as though the physical world held no meaning. Another strange officer class also emerged among the word-bearers during the Horus Heresy. These warriors came to be known as Diabolists, a name first used by the Ultramarines during the bitter fighting at Calf. Within the Legion, the title was eventually embraced as a sign of grim distinction. Diabolists were commanders who had devoted themselves to the study of the warp and learned to wield its energies in battle. Through rituals and forbidden knowledge, they summoned manifestations of the immaterial realm, shaping the powers of the ether into weapons against their enemies. Their transformation demanded a terrible price, for those who walked this path had already surrendered their souls to the influence of chaos. In the long centuries following the Horus Heresy, the word-bearers remained unusual among the traitor legions because they preserved much of their earlier discipline and structure. Their faith had changed profoundly, yet the devotion that guided their actions endured with the same intensity. The warriors of the Legion did not divide their loyalty among individual gods. Instead, they revered the dark powers as a single pantheon, honoring the unity of chaos undivided. Because of this belief, they often regarded those who devoted themselves to only one god with quiet disdain, and their relationship with the Emperor's children remained strained due to that legion's devotion to Slanesh alone. In battle, the word-bearers frequently called upon summoned demons to form the front ranks of their assaults. These entities surged forward as shock troops while the elite Chaos Space Marines carried out the tasks that demanded precision and skill. Large numbers of cultists also marched alongside them, though these mortal followers were often used simply as expendable forces or diversions. One of the most striking features of the Legion's organization was the continued presence of chaplains, now known as Dark Apostles. These figures served as both spiritual guides and leaders of the warriors around them. before battle, the Legion gathered in solemn rituals, chanting hymns and reciting doctrines that affirmed their belief in chaos undivided. At times, these chants were answered by the arrival of demonic allies who joined them upon the battlefield. At the heart of the Legion's leadership stood the Dark Council, an inner circle of the most powerful Dark Apostles. From their immense fortress cathedral known as the Basilica of the Word upon the demon world of Sicarus, they governed the Legion in the long absence of their Primarch. Lorgar had withdrawn into meditation within the temple in Physio, seeking communion with the powers he had come to serve. Each Dark Apostle commanded a warband known as a host, a formation whose size could vary widely. Some hosts contained only a few dozen warriors, while others rivaled the strength of an entire Space Marine chapter. Within these hosts, the hierarchy shifted frequently according to the will of the apostle who led them, and the warriors accepted these changes without question. Most commonly, the host resembled the structure of a company, divided into squads of roughly a dozen Chaos Space Marines, led by champions eager to prove their devotion. When these warriors marched to war, they advanced beneath their banners while chanting harsh litanies of hatred, the pounding of ritual drums echoing across the battlefield. Among the honored elites of the Legion were the warriors known as the Anointed, who fought within ancient suits of Terminator armor regarded as sacred relics. Membership in this cult was for life, and because the warriors of the Legion could live for countless centuries through the combined effects of their Astartes biology and the influence of chaos, the ranks of the Anointed rarely changed. Many among them had fought in the distant past beside Lorgar during the Great Siege of Terra. Their victories were celebrated within the flesh halls of Sicarus and remembered within the grim records preserved in the Legion's dark temples. When a host marched to battle, it was not uncommon for an icon bearer and a large contingent of anointed Terminators to accompany the Dark Apostles' chosen commanders, silent guardians whose presence embodied the enduring faith of the word-bearers. And so the story of the 17th Legion closes, where perhaps it was always meant to end, in the long shadow cast by belief, twisted into ruin. They had begun as the Imperial Heralds, black armored messengers who walked alone before the armies of the Imperium, their skull helms and winged maces offering one final choice before the fires came. Behind them followed the gray ranks of a legion that tore down temples, burned idols, and reduced ancient certainties to ash in the name of the Imperial Truth. Yet within that work lay the seed of their undoing. No legion spent longer staring into the heart of faith, or learned more completely how deeply belief can root itself inside the minds of men. They were taught to destroy worship, to break it stone by stone and word by word, but in doing so they became a mirror of the thing they hunted. What they once cast down in others, they slowly raised within themselves, first as devotion, then as doctrine, and at last as betrayal. Lorgar gave that hunger its voice. Under him, the iconoclasts who had once burned shrines became builders of cathedrals. The herald who had spoken the Emperor's ultimatum before temple gates became the priest who taught whole worlds to kneel. And when the Emperor shattered Monarchia and cast down the faith the Legion had offered him, the wound did not kill their need for gods. It only drove that need into darker places. From that moment, the path was set. The word bearers did not fall in a single night. They crossed over slowly, with scripture on their lips and certainty in their hearts, until at last they became the first great prophets of treachery in the age of the Imperium. They carried the worship of chaos across the stars with the same patience and discipline they had once used to spread compliance. Worlds burned, brother turned upon brother, and the heresy itself was fed by truths they had poisoned long before open war began. Even after the fires of Terra had faded, they endured. In the eye of terror and the maelstrom, beneath dark councils and the silence of their withdrawn Primarch, they continued the same war they had always fought, only now in another name. Still they preach, still they tear down one creed to raise another. Still they move through the galaxy as bearers of words that promise revelation and leave only damnation behind. If betrayal can be measured, then theirs remains among the greatest ever known, not only because they turned against the Imperium, but because they understood so well how faith could move the soul and chose to corrupt that truth into a weapon. So the 17th Legion is remembered not merely as conquerors, nor only as heretics, but as the cruelest of heralds. Once they came to burning temples and broken idols in the service of the Emperor. Later they returned with darker scriptures, and whole worlds followed them into the fire. And wherever black armor walks beneath a sky red with ash, wherever a skull helm turns toward the faithful, wherever old shrines burn and new altars rise from the ruins, the lesson of the word bearers endures. They were the heralds of truth only for a little while. After that, they became the heralds of ruin.